California, Irvine. Entonces yo voy a presentar a ella primero. A ver si se escucha mejor. Voy a presentar a ella primero y después voy a presentar a cada uno de los comentaristas, si están de acuerdo. Y vamos a tener como una ponencia de más o menos 40 minutos. Ellos después van a comentar y luego vamos a abrirle a preguntas de ustedes. Entonces, nos da muchísimo gusto tener aquí a la doctora Victoria Bernal. Ella es profesora de antropología en la Universidad de California, Irvine, y sus investigaciones tocan muchos temas que se relacionan con la política, el género, la migración y las diásporas, la guerra, la sociedad civil y el activismo y los medios digitales. Entonces, como pueden ver, trata un rango muy amplio de temas a lo largo de una carrera muy destacada. Su libro más reciente es La Nación como Red, Diásporas, Ciberespacio y Ciudadanía, que se publicó en 2014. Pero también con la doctora Inderpal Gruwal, es la coeditora de una antología sobre las ONGs que se llama Teorizar a las ONGs, Estados, Feminismos y Neoliberalismo, que también se publicó en el 2014 y es conocido como un volumen muy destacado dentro del campo de los estudios sobre las ONGs. De hecho, muchas personas lo ven como un parteaguas. La doctora Bernal ha llevado a cabo investigaciones etnográficas en Sudán, Tanzania, Eritrea, el Valle de Silicón, en Estados Unidos y también en el ciberespacio, como van a ver. Ella es una integrante del Centro de Estudios Avanzados en las Ciencias Sociales de Stanford University, en donde está haciendo una estancia en este año con una investigación sobre la privacidad digital y cuestiones de seguridad en el Internet. Y va a hablar sobre la infopolítica y la democracia. Bueno, bienvenida.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Annalise and Edith for organizing this. I'm very, very happy to be here at UNAM and interested to discuss with you and connect with you. So I'm really very happy. And surprisingly, maybe, I'm starting off in Africa, but we will eventually make our way to North America. I developed the concept infopolitics to draw attention to struggles over the management of information, which I argue make politics in the 21st century distinct. The repressive security state in Eritrea is a good example of how sovereign power is exercised in part by managing information through secrecy, censorship, and restrictions on freedom of expression, coupled with the prolific production of official national narratives and state-controlled news. Digital media disrupts state control by offering spaces of expression and sources of news that are alternative to and beyond the management of government. Much of the, let me see if I can do this, okay. He was so handsome. It's too bad he turned out to be a monster. Much of the activity in Eritrean cyberspace, the establishment of key political websites and the posting of content to them is carried out by Eritreans in diaspora, Eritreans who, many of them fled the country during the independence struggle, but now new waves are also fleeing. And this paper draws on my long-term research project that, oh, sorry, okay. Yes, I will. I'm sorry. I feel like I want to tell you too much, but yeah, I will go slower. So yeah, discúlpame. This paper draws on my long-term research project that analyzes Eritrean politics online, as well as a new project that I'm developing on digital surveillance, cybersecurity, and privacy that focuses on the U.S. security state, to bring into focus the ways that contemporary struggles for democracy and threats to democracy are deeply entwined with digital media. This paper is partly the story of my own research trajectory and how my research as an Africanist could lead me to the U.S. and Silicon Valley. Repression under Isaias Afewerki's regime has caused Eritreans to flee their country, as an earlier generation once did in flight from Ethiopian oppression and war. But Eritreans in diaspora locate themselves within the broader context of Eritrean nationhood rather than outside of it, and they continue to figure in the national imaginary of Eritrea on the part of Eritrea's leaders. Eritreans in diaspora have an intense and involving engagement with the Eritrean state. Many remain involved in Eritrean politics, although they are citizens of other countries. At the same time, the president of Eritrea refers in his speeches to, quote, "my compatriots at home and abroad," and in other ways makes clear that diaspora Eritreans are part of the nation. While much scholarship has focused on questions concerning legal status of migrants, there's a growing body of research revealing the increasing range of intermediate forms of national inclusion and belonging that connect migrants and diasporas to the states they left. The significance of the internet to this development is that diasporas can not only consume national media from abroad, they can produce national media, construct or contribute to public representations of the nation, and promote or contest the legitimacy of those wielding state power. Because of the ambiguous and indeterminate location of websites, in particular, such activities are not experienced in the same way as the long-distance nationalisms of the past. One reason I developed the concept of infopolitics was to complicate ideas about what the internet offers, to draw attention to the fact that there is always a politics of information at work, shaping who expresses what to whom, for what purpose, and by what authority. From this perspective, how people mobilize online or cultivate new political subjectivities through social media are complex processes that cannot be explained simply by the affordances of the technologies themselves or reduced to simple questions of access to information or to computers. Eritreans in diaspora have used digital media in creative ways to various ends. Most significantly, Eritreans in diaspora created national space online. In this space, they established a digital public sphere that forms part of Eritrea's political field. During the 1998-2000 border war with Ethiopia, they used these websites to defend the nation, in particular by mobilizing fundraising efforts to help the Eritrean state wage war. That national space online, which they initially used to support the state, proved to be even more significant following the war, when the popularity of the government sank as it crushed all critical expression, jailed its critics, including members of its own government and journalists, and closed the independent press. At that key moment, Eritreans began to use cyberspace as a platform for mobilizing dissent against the regime, so that national space they had created online could serve a new kind of purpose, and people could use it to express and debate alternative perspectives on Eritrean politics and society. The public sphere of websites expanded the boundaries of what could be publicly articulated, and through debates and analyses shared by posters, dissent was gradually established as a legitimate Eritrean activity, at least among the diaspora. And this was a big struggle because they had all been nationalists supporting independence and supporting the movement, and it was very difficult for people to criticize and not be seen as betraying the nation. Of course, the government still sees it as treason. There's no independent press or civil society public sphere in Eritrea, so cyberspace has been very important as a means to pressure the regime and mobilize opposition. Eritrea's government does not trust its own citizens, and it fears the power of connectivity. The regime rejected an undersea cable that would have increased Eritrea's bandwidth, for example. A 2015 article in Bloomberg News describes Eritrea as one of the least connected countries in the world, comparing it to North Korea. The regime wants to restrict access, yet Eritreans combine their on-the-ground social networks of kinship, peer group, neighborhood, and other communities with online forms of connection to rapidly spread communication nationally and transnationally. Websites can be seen as constituting a unique political space, which can be both inside and outside the nation at the same time. On the one hand, posters in diaspora often write as if they were located in Eritrea, referring to this country, for example. Yet on the other hand, they can denounce the president as a dictator and make other statements it would be unsafe to put in writing if they really were in Eritrea. Websites are used by Eritreans then as an ambiguous and elastic space, which can serve at times to extend the nation and state sovereignty across borders, and at other times can be used as an extraterritorial space, safe for civil society and dissent because of its location outside Eritrea. An emerging body of scholarship is providing a range of insights about how the internet might be transforming politics in ways that go beyond simple issues of providing information or greater transparency. Some research suggests that with the rise of new media, quote, government is simply one of many competing sites, end quote. In the Eritrean case, the decentering effect of new media is particularly meaningful because of the top-down method of governing by the Eritrean state. A Human Rights Watch report about Eritrea says, quote, the Isaias government has granted no independent civil society institution authority to operate. They don't allow foreign NGOs either. All labor organizations and youth and women groups that may appear to be NGOs are actually appendages of the ruling party. All news media are owned and closely supervised by the government and relentlessly used as instruments of propaganda. So we're really seeing this infopolitics at work. In late January 2013, rumors of an attempted coup in Eritrea circulated widely among Eritreans, and the traffic to an important diaspora website, awate.com, was so great that it couldn't handle it and was out of service for several days. But at the same time, the official government website of Eritrea's Ministry of Information made no mention of any kind about these political events. And beneath the ministry's slogan, which is, quote, serving the truth, they had the headline, quote, preparation underway in the eastern escarpment in the central region to plant temperate fruits. So that's the kind of, so the extreme measures of repression at work in Eritrea have forced civil society into diaspora and into the alternative public spaces created online. Awate's motto on its homepage is inform, inspire, embolden. And the link about us on their website describes Awate's purpose as, quote, to serve as an antidote to the stifling propaganda of the Eritrean state media and its tentacles in Europe and North America. And these are some of the mottos of the other important websites, Dahai and Awate and Asmarino. What's particularly distinctive about the internet and social media is the decentered people-to-people character of communications, in contrast to the centralized communications of broadcast media and government communications with citizens. In the Middle East, Eichelman and Anderson found that the accessibility of new media widens the base of producers and senders and creates public space. And as I've indicated, this notion of cyberspace as public space has serious implications because it allows us to see that websites allow for more than simply easy access to information or cheap communication. They serve as spaces that bring people together. And the public space offered by websites is particularly important under conditions like those in Eritrea, where public space inside the country is under tight government control and surveillance. At any given moment, an array of topics are being addressed on each of the Eritrean websites, and posts range from analytical essays to humor to insults and so on. But I focused very much on the political content of these websites. All right, I'm already going to skip some points. Eritreans in diaspora then have created in cyberspace a public sphere of citizenship and belonging more successful in achieving democratic dialogue than any within Eritrea. And I should mention, I said before that connectivity is very limited in Eritrea, but of course those who are connected spread the word to their friends and relatives, and also the government. People who work in government are connected. So one of the functions of these websites is that it's a conduit of people expressing dissent actually to the government, and being able to get away with it. So these websites do not merely meet the diaspora's need for connection to Eritrea and to other Eritreans, but they provide something for all Eritreans, whether in diaspora or at home, that their government has refused to provide: an open public sphere for citizens to engage autonomously in politics. Online activities extend beyond the realm of the virtual, blurring the boundaries between the diaspora and the nation and exerting influence on political understandings and actions. The main websites that I've studied, Dahai, Awate, and Asmarino, have had material consequences: fundraising in the beginning for development, aid, and also for war, mobilizing political activities and demonstrations, and various campaigns of criticism of the government. The online activities of Eritreans in diaspora show that the internet offers much more politically than simply making information accessible, providing a new means of fact-checking. Websites are products of culture and history as much as they are products of digital technologies. The Eritrean diaspora has engaged with these technologies in distinctive and evolving ways which relate to the changing conditions in Eritrea. One of the most innovative political interventions was the establishment of a virtual war memorial on Awate.com that they called the Martyrs Album. Using leaked government documents that somebody inside Eritrea's government had leaked to the managers of the website, they acted like the state in creating a national war memorial in cyberspace, providing a public service that the government had failed to provide, informing people of the numbers and the identities of the people that were killed in the 1998-2000 border war with Ethiopia. And in the context of that memorial and other texts that people have posted, they've used digital media to redefine the nation as rooted in the connections of Eritreans to each other and the obligations of Eritreans to each other, rather than their ties to the state and their obligations to the government. And this has been a very an arduous process, a lot of work to try to decenter the meaning of what it means to be Eritrean and to decenter it from your loyalty to the state being what defines you as Eritrean. Many Eritreans in Eritrea long to escape to places they hope will have more freedom, and many Eritreans in diaspora long to return home, at least for a visit, but fear to enter the country if they have in any way been associated with politics. The space of cyberspace is crucial to connecting the dispersed diaspora to one another and to their homeland independent of the state, and the websites are the most significant political initiatives undertaken independently of national authorities. These websites continue to generate novel ideas and political experiments. They reveal the creative strategies of the less powerful to construct new spaces and strategies of political participation and to expand the boundaries of what can be expressed in public. I was finishing my book about this research, Nation as Network, when Edward Snowden's revelations about the U.S. government's massive digital surveillance programs hit the news. To my surprise, the majority of Americans, including many academic colleagues, were not terribly alarmed and soon seemed to largely forget about it. I had a much stronger reaction. In fact, even before Snowden, I had become aware that I was observing a strange convergence so that the characteristics once used to distinguish northern democracies from illiberal southern regimes no longer seemed clear. The heightened significance of military in the U.S., the color-coded threat warnings, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, so-called enhanced interrogation, torture, police violence against unarmed citizens, drone killings, the persecution of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, along with various more banal and subtle shifts in nationalistic expression and behavior, all slipped down a slippery slope away from the rule of law and democratic practices. My work on Eritrea's paranoid security state had sensitized me to the dangers of elevating national security above all other values and using purported threats to justify curtailing rights. So I was fascinated to understand why more Americans why more Americans did not share my apprehensions, and to understand how digital media was a double-edged sword that empowered citizens, but perhaps empowered powerful states in extraordinary ways. And the heart of this project that I began to develop are questions about how technology experts understand privacy and digital rights, how the U.S. government promotes discourses and practices around terrorism and cybersecurity, and how ideas about digital media and national security are explained to the public through mainstream media, events, and museum exhibitions. I spent this academic year conducting research among technology privacy activists in Silicon Valley, and in the middle of that research, the battle between Apple and the FBI broke out. I don't know if all of you have followed that, but the FBI demanded that Apple decrypt and unlock a cell phone connected with mass killings in San Bernardino, California. And the CEO of Apple refused to do that. And it brought these attentions into the news in a very big way. In my view, the Apple versus FBI controversy illustrates how taking the U.S. war on terror online raises new issues and new challenges for democracy. And I start from two fundamental perspectives. One, that pervasive government surveillance is a threat to civil society and to the free expression crucial to an open society. And two, that privacy is not simply a private matter, but a very social one. The debates about iPhone security and encryption more generally need to be placed in the context of the rise of state discourses about cyber threats and cybersecurity and the ways that these threats and the appropriate response to them are being constructed for the public. I argue that cybersecurity, as currently formulated by the U.S. government, extends militarism into cyberspace and into our everyday lives in a new and significant ways. There are a number of factors, however, that make democratic deliberation around issues of digital surveillance, cybersecurity, and privacy very difficult. Most important are government secrecy around both threats and surveillance activities, which make it nearly impossible for the average citizen to assess the need for surveillance measures or how effective those measures are in making Americans safer. The other factor is what I call the opacity of digital media. And here there's a paradox in that the information technologies that are hailed as liberating and promoting transparency are themselves now so complex, as well as shrouded behind much proprietary code and corporate secrecy, that the average citizen does not understand how they work. Moreover, our experience of these media creates an illusion and hides the way that data travels, is stored, collected, circulated, and analyzed. It's true that government spying and surveillance are not new in themselves, but digital surveillance is new and different, because never before have so many elements of people's lives been available in such an extensive, often written down, storable, searchable, and analyzable manner that is both pervasive and unobtrusive. Furthermore, people have no true exit option. They're not going to stop using cell phones or the internet. On the contrary, the Internet of Things, which some have already labeled the surveillance of things, is expanding the digital into ever more facets of our lives. One question I began with was why Americans were not more alarmed and outraged by Snowden's revelations. And I have several answers to that question. And I think I can contrast it in some ways to why people did seem to respond more to the Apple FBI controversy. And I think one of the differences is that, I'm jumping ahead. All right. I'll come back to that. The Apple FBI controversy seems to have resonated more powerfully with Americans. There were demonstrations outside of Apple stores in support, and there were a lot of media attention and discussion of these things. But, you know, what does it mean when a corporate CEO, in a way, sparks a social movement, and when the corporation defends the rights of its consumers against a government and people rally outside the stores of a corporation? And in that, so part of what's missing there really is a discussion of democracy and the role of citizens in deciding important matters that affect society. The iPhone, I think one reason the iPhone resonated more strongly with people, though, is that it made some of the abstract issues of digital surveillance concrete for people. People have a relationship with their phones. They're on or near their bodies round the clock. The phones contain photos, contacts, calendars. It is almost as if the FBI was saying it wants to read people's diaries. And this then made that surveillance much more personal. And the slogan of the rallies that was organized by a group that called itself Fight for the Future, the slogan they promoted was, quote, "Don't break my phone." And I think even that sense of that this is personal, this is my phone, this is personal. But what concerns me is that I think the NSA's digital surveillance and the so-called backdoor sought by the FBI, that the FBI wanted to be able to always access even encrypted material in the phone, contribute to an unprecedented militarization of domains of private, civil, and social life. And I see this as very much related to the culture and politics of the U.S. war on terror, and how that combining the war on terror with the permeation of digital media into everyday life has changed the conditions of our politics in very interesting way. So, as I said, one of the issues that has made it difficult for citizens to respond is what I call the opacity of digital media, that people experience digital media in ways that do not correspond to how these technologies actually work. And the fact that mass surveillance could be conducted while subjects remained unaware of the data the state was stockpiling on them is evidence of how digital technologies are transforming domains of experience. These technologies make it easier for surveillance to be carried out unobtrusively and from a distance. And even after Snowden's revelations, people knew intellectually that information on their phone and email was being collected and stored by the government, but they still had the illusion of privacy because there's no intrusion, there's no interruption or any sensory cue about the surveillance. And so people have an illusion of privacy when writing an email or sending a text, for example, because they don't really know the process by which it travels to the recipient. This is one of the less recognized aspects, I think, of Snowden's revelations. It is not only that Americans didn't know what their government was doing, collecting their data, they did not know that many of these kinds of digital capabilities even existed. They didn't know that data could be intercepted at key transfer points, or that devices could be turned on remotely, or that someone could witness your keystrokes as you type. And it's difficult for many people to grasp the significance of digital surveillance because there's nothing in their routine experience that indicates the government is tracking and recording them. Corporations spam us and so on, so we have some awareness that they're collecting our data, but even so, we're not really seeing how our data is stored, sold, and circulated and analyzed by corporations. All of that happens behind the scenes. And that opacity is reflected rather than reduced by the infamous terms of use agreements that we all click agreement on without reading. Algorithms are also opaque, some because of proprietary code. I mean, Facebook has, and Google, they have their secret algorithms that determine what you might see in a given internet search so that each person is not seeing the same thing when they search. And apparently even coders sometimes have difficulty explaining why a particular algorithm generates the distinct results that it generates. So most people, including myself, don't fully even understand everything Snowden uncovered. The number of government programs, PRISM, XKeyscore, Upstream, and more, and the specifics of how each of those worked is complicated. And many articles have been written trying to make sense of all that Snowden revealed, and the question, for example, of what metadata are and what they tell about us. Of course, the growing consensus is that metadata actually tell a whole lot about us as individuals. I think particularly notable about the U.S. surveillance program is that they installed splitters with the agreement of the company AT&T to send copies of all data to a government server. So they weren't just getting information from the corporation. They actually physically built a material surveillance infrastructure that didn't exist before. So paradoxically, the digital technology that has been hailed as making information widely available is so complex and it's working so hidden that democratic deliberation and participatory decision-making about digital matters becomes very difficult. Lawyers, for example, find that judges and juries can't always make sensible legal determinations because they don't really understand how digital media work. They don't understand what happens when using the Tor network, for example. And we know, of course, that the law lags far behind. Technology develops much faster than the legal system to regulate it. So I suggest it's not simply the opacity of digital media and the unobtrusive nature of digital surveillance that explain sort of Americans' passivity in response to the Snowden revelations, but also the security culture practiced and promoted by the U.S. government after 9/11 that has made surveillance part of the everyday American way of life. Let's see. I think I'm lost track of my slides, but since 9/11, new logics of threat and security organized around the idea of terror rather than a fixed enemy have expanded the authority of the state into gray areas. The war on terror blurs boundaries between war and peace. This is temporal in how this distinction between wartime and peacetime is diminished, and it's spatial in the ways that war zones and civilian spaces cease to be clearly differentiated. In the war on terror, enemies, threats, and so on are continual, everywhere, ongoing, and not limited to specific targets or places, but premised on the idea that attacks could happen anywhere, anytime. The war on terror changed Americans' expectations of privacy in relation to the state through experiences like the airport screening practices and wider campaigns, notably, if you see something, say something, which is still pervasive in the U.S. today. And I think that campaign is very interesting because it reflects the erosion of borders between private and public and the relationship between citizens and the state. All citizens are recruited to be vigilant and to be informers, and simultaneously all citizens are suspect. So the state casts everyone as a potential threat or a potential agent of the state, and everyday life is subtly militarized. And this was along with the color-coded threat levels, which they seem to have eliminated because they always kept it at orange. I'm not even sure what orange meant, but particularly if you were changing planes in Chicago's airport, O'Hare, it was like every 15 minutes a big announcement would come on saying, the threat level is orange. And it just creates a certain atmosphere. And we have, along with that, of course, the proliferation of security cameras in public places. And all of these range of experiences have contributed to reducing Americans' expectations of privacy in relationship to the state. People have grown accustomed to the idea that the government needs to watch and screen everyone in order to find the few who pose actual threats. And this underlying rationale was articulated explicitly by government officials defending mass surveillance, and they used the metaphor of the haystack, saying, quote, we need a haystack to find a needle. So that was their argument, that we need to collect everything so that we can search for the few significant things in there. But of course, that quaint framing about a haystack sidesteps the question of whose haystack it is and who has the right to search in it. This ethos of unbounded surveillance was central to post 9/11 security practices. And so in many ways, the surveillance by the NSA, the National Security Agency, built on that foundation. The way the war on terror is waged at home among American citizens through discourses such as, if you see something, say something, suggests that threats are ever present, and therefore vigilance must become a quotidian habit for government and citizens alike. Americans got used to having the contents of their purses and briefcases screened, to body scans at the airport, and other invasive experiences. The state says it is responsible for protecting the nation, but it also sees its own citizens as potentially suspect and therefore must violate their privacy. And this sounds very familiar to someone who has studied Eritrea. Fear of the alternative, being left vulnerable to threats, is used to rationalize these intrusive experiences that many people find inconvenient and unpleasant. What is so distinct and transformative about digital technology in relation to privacy and security is the pervasive, unobtrusive nature of data sharing, which is so central to the internet. All right, I'm going to skip some of this. Because I think we don't. The war on terror changed the boundaries between citizens and the state. At the same time, the rise of social media and digital activities, such as sharing, linking, retweeting, friending, have transformed people's social experiences and conceptions of their private lives. Private life has been understood as something conducted within circumscribed social boundaries and in distinct spaces, particularly our homes. But digital media situate us instead as individual nodes within vast networks of social relationships. We have and are Facebook friends, followers of Twitter and of blogs and so on. Our relations are not circumscribed, but rather flexible and potentially extensive. Indeed, many people take pride in the sheer numbers of their Facebook friends, LinkedIn contacts, blog followers, retweets, and so on. In addition, the mobile access to connectivity afforded by digital media renders spatial distinctions between where our public and private lives are conducted obsolete. We can connect to and from anywhere, home, office, street, cafe. We use our personal phones and email addresses for business, like Hillary Clinton, and our business devices and email addresses for intimate relationships. The kind of space in which we are located is no longer clearly associated with the public or private nature of our communications when we are using digital media. From the perspective of the state, such vast networks of private communications and social relations are inherently bound up with threats and security. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the rise of cybersecurity. An analysis of recent American mainstream journalism, statements by public officials and experts suggest that public culture surrounding the internet is undergoing a profound shift. Where the digital, despite its origins in military development, had come to be associated with new forms of freedom and community, it is now increasingly being depicted as a new form of warfare and threat. A headline on the front page of the Wall Street Journal's European edition proclaimed, quote, "Cyber war ignites new arms race," end quote, and explains that, quote, "Getting into the cyber weapon club is available to almost anyone with cash and a computer." End quote. The last season of one of my favorite shows, one of my guilty pleasures, is Homeland, which is, Islamophobic and all, everything that one shouldn't like, but I can't help it. But the last season of that had an opening montage that included a voiceover that said, quote, "Soldiers are hackers and the battlefield is online." And it also had a voiceover of John Kerry saying, quote, "Edward Snowden is a coward," which I thought was interesting. Last year, October 2015, President Obama proclaimed as, quote, "National Cybersecurity Awareness Month." And I went to the website of the Department of Homeland Security to find out more about that, and they said the goal was, quote, "to increase the resiliency of the nation in the event of a cyber incident," end quote. And so it's noteworthy that the goal is not even to prevent whatever catastrophe a cyber incident might be, but that's already inevitable, and all we can do apparently is try to minimize the damage by increasing our resiliency. Most importantly, I think the ways in which cybersecurity is being articulated involves the blurring of key distinctions between digital privacy, data security, personal security, corporate interests, and national security. A widely circulated article in the Washington Post about Ashton Carter, former Deputy Defense Secretary, being chosen by President Obama to head the Pentagon, stated, quote, "His nomination signals that the administration is likely to continue to aggressively build on its ability to fight adversaries in the digital world," end quote. And then they quote Ashton Carter as saying, quote, "It's a new field of warfare," end quote. In September 2015, President Obama likened the internet to nuclear weapons when he said, quote, "Among states, there has to be a framework for online security that is analogous to what we've done with nuclear power because nobody stands to gain from the attacks." So it's presenting a new world of danger that must be militarized. At a February 2015 event billed as the first summit meeting on online security and consumer protection, President Obama asserted that, quote, "The cyber world is the wild, wild west. To some degree, we're asked to be the sheriff," the United States, in other words, end quote. And a chief scientist from a cybersecurity software company that was there is quoted in the same article as saying, "The government is responsible for protecting our borders, be they physical or cyber," end quote. But of course, we have to ask, what are U.S. borders in cyberspace? And that cybersecurity corporate person goes on to say that, quote, "The government has to create a safe, secure environment for legitimate business," end quote. So that's a good example of how the current militaristic framing of cybersecurity blurs the question of who or what is being threatened or being made secure. Protecting our borders sounds like preventing the invasion of the nation, but that's conjured up and seamlessly conjoined to the issue of creating a secure business environment. And the interests of citizens, who even in the title of that event and in most of the coverage, are often glossed only as consumers or users. And I call that phenomenon the disappearing citizen, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. So I use that phrase, the disappearing citizen, to make visible the discourse that invokes people as users and consumers rather than as citizens, and to critically reflect on how such discourse deflects democratic engagement. For one thing, questions of rights and issues of democratic participation are associated with the notion of citizen in ways they are not associated with being a user or a consumer. Citizen invokes a relationship to the state, while user-consumer highlights a relationship to corporations. Expectations of the government in terms of accountability, transparency, and responsiveness to citizens' concerns are quite different from our expectations about corporations. We don't expect democratic processes from corporations, and we don't expect corporations to be safeguarding our rights. Apple did this in the fight against the FBI, but Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, was never elected. He's not accountable to American citizens, and the corporate business model of Apple may change. Hailing people as consumers in discussions about our digital lives also obscures the very important role of government and the rights of citizens. In addition, the notion of users and consumers misstates our relation to digital media. Digital media are not simply technologies people use or consume in order, no, they're not simply technologies people use or consume or use in order to consume. Digital media are entwined in the fabric of our lives. They're connected to our sense of self, who and what we care about, what interests us, and how we express and define ourselves. The blurring of distinctions between data security, personal security, corporate interest, and national security was strikingly evident in the reporting and government responses to the hacking of Sony in December 2014. I don't know how much coverage that got in Mexico, but in the US it was a big scandal that hackers got into the movie studio Sony and released documents and so on. And this hack of a corporation came to be figured as an attack on the American way of life, on our democratic values like freedom of expression, and it was labeled cyber terrorism by government officials. Joseph Masco has written a wonderful book about the culture of American national security, and he argues that the counter-terror following 9/11 created, quote, an unlimited space and time horizon for military state action, and, quote, a world without borders generating threats without limits. And we can see how that translates extremely well to scenarios of threat in cyberspace, because it's already imagined as borderless and future-oriented. Where am I? In the 9/11 attacks, thousands of American civilians were killed and millions of dollars of property damage was done. The kind of harm done, oh, okay, all right. That's what I was afraid of, but I have 3 more pages. The kind of harm done by hackers and the nature of the threats they pose is much murkier. Important questions remain, moreover, about who or what are the targets of potential digital threats and what exactly is at stake in so-called cyber attacks. Most significantly, what does cybersecurity mean and who or what is to be secured in the digital context? A New York Times article following the Sony hack states that, quote, the government administration officials noted that the White House has now described the action against Sony as an attack as opposed to mere theft of intellectual property, and that suggested Mr. Obama is looking for a government response rather than a corporate one. So here we see the boundary between the public government and private corporation shifting. That harm done to a corporation calls for a government response. I mean, alternatively, one could view this as a case of Sony being lax in not using stronger passwords or encryption. And then I'll skip some of these, but in the Wall Street Journal article, an article titled Stopping the Next Cyber Assault, Mike Rogers, chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, called the Sony hack cyber terrorism and refers to it as, quote, the North Korean government's campaign against Sony. And other officials, I'm going to skip, but they basically say this is an attack on free expression, so it's an attack on America. So calling the revelation of private information, which however much emotional harm it causes, does no physical injury, cyber terrorism, clearly seeks to recast digital activities in a new and dangerous light. In the aftermath of the San Bernardino killings, authorities seemed more concerned about WhatsApp and encrypted iPhone data than about the actual guns used to kill victims. So this is not simply about expanding the criminalization of hacking, but of redefining digital activities in military terms. And the same, I got to go faster, but this is an interesting part too, is that the same military contractors that design weapons systems have now become providers of cybersecurity to the government, and there's sort of a revolving door between government and private industry, so people from the defense contractors and government military people now also start cybersecurity firms. General Keith B. Alexander, who was the former director of the NSA, is an example. He now runs his own cybersecurity firm. I'm almost done. Yet at the same time of promoting these questions about cybersecurity and government officials, former government officials and military contractors creating cybersecurity firms, at the same time, the U.S. government opposes robust encryption of personal data. So we can see here the way that cybersecurity is being constructed around government and corporate interests, not around the interests of citizens. And it's interesting, too, that the government secret surveillance that was revealed by Snowden is consistently described by officials as, quote, data collection, data gathering, and monitoring, all very benign-sounding scientific terms. Whereas, you know, a hack like the Sony hack is terrorism. So one of the premises of securitization studies is that threats are not simply givens that exist, but rather that threats are constructed through political discourse. And we can see that going on in the way that cybersecurity is being constructed in the US today. One of the notions underpinning ideas about the destructive force of the internet is connectivity itself, the fact that so many facets of daily life now are linked to digital networks. This, if you can read this, it's very funny. I don't know, you know, what artist or political group did it, but it's basically saying, you know, you are a potential criminal. Perhaps you secretly doubt the sanctity of corporate property and, you know, laws that protect the rich, but it's made to look as if it's official. So, you know, from the government's perspective, the interconnectedness, where am I? Okay, all right. Made possible by digital technologies is being used to construct a world where nothing lies outside of strategic military concerns. And I mean, in terms of one of the arguments of the US government too, is that even the military relies to some extent on commercial digital networks. So physically, there is not, you know, a disconnect between what's military and what's not in terms of the internet. And as digital media become ever more interwoven into our daily lives in all domains, including the growing development of the Internet of Things, we face a growing militarization of our quotidian world. Increasingly, citizens are being asked to give up rights in exchange for security. And the opacity of digital media complicate this because people are in effect being asked to give up things when they do not fully understand what they are giving up or the potential consequences for them and for society. This is a new development in post-9/11 American culture that portends profound consequences for citizenship and for scholarship, as we are encouraged to conceptualize information technologies as potential weapons, to understand digital activities like hacking as acts of war, and to envision possible social and technological futures through the constraints of a militaristic lens focused on the security of state power and corporate property at the expense of civil liberties. Contests between states and citizens over these issues will set important conceptual, political, and institutional foundations for the future of democracy. Thank you so much. Sorry to take so long.
Pues muchísimas gracias. Yo creo que hay mucho que comentar en esta ponencia. Vamos a dar la palabra a nuestros comentaristas y vamos a empezar con Juan Carlos Barrón. Juan Carlos es doctor en Filosofía del Desarrollo Internacional y maestro de investigación en estudios del desarrollo por la Universidad de East Anglia, en el Reino Unido. Es egresado del Seminario de Teoría Crítica del Colegio Birkbeck de la Universidad de Londres y es candidato a investigador nacional de CONACYT. Actualmente, aquí en el CISAN, desarrolla el proyecto Medios Masivos de Comunicación en América del Norte, México en el imaginario social estadounidense y canadiense, en el área de estudios estratégicos aquí del CISAN. También, en lo relacionado con la ponencia, forma parte del equipo de coordinación del Comité de Investigación sobre Sociocibernética de la Asociación Internacional de Sociología. Es coordinador internacional de la línea de investigación en violencia del doctorado en Ciencias y Humanidades para el Desarrollo Interdisciplinario de la Universidad de Coahuila y de la UNAM y participa activamente en el Seminario de Complejidad de la División de Investigación de la Facultad de Contaduría y Administración en nuestra máxima casa de estudios. Gracias.
Gracias, Annalise. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la excelente presentación y muy provocativa exposición y las imágenes que nos has presentado para fortalecer tu punto. Realmente ha sido muy interesante. Me gusta mucho cómo se plantea la conexión entre Eritrea y Estados Unidos. Es una cosa que a mí me parece importante porque a veces solemos pensar que estos problemas son como propios de países pequeños o periféricos y no propios de las potencias hegemónicas. Y bueno, por supuesto, en el caso particular de Estados Unidos, en México hay muchísimas preocupaciones relacionadas con este tema y muchas veces pensamos que esto está ocurriendo porque nosotros tenemos una democracia débil o un gobierno débil y pues bueno, hacer esta comparación me parece muy importante. Me parece que el concepto que usas de Infopolitics es bastante útil para ir entendiendo cómo se está desarrollando estas políticas de la información. Yo quisiera iniciar, hablar un poco de lo que yo trabajo y empezar con la pregunta que planteas tú en tu trabajo y es ¿de quién es este artefacto? Y eso es lo que yo quisiera poner en el centro. Solemos pensar que es nuestro y es esa batalla política de realmente a quién pertenece este artefacto. Y entonces, como yo lo estoy estudiando, pues es a través de teoría de sistemas y estoy estudiando el sistema de medios de comunicación y lo veo como un sistema compuesto por dispositivos de control poblacional y territorial, que está acoplado estructuralmente al sistema de telecomunicaciones, que es en donde está el Internet y es en donde está el teléfono. Y por supuesto, los gobiernos se habían quedado un poco atrás en la capacidad para controlar estos artefactos, que son de control corporativo. Todavía en este momento, cuando nos preguntamos de quién es este artefacto, la respuesta es de cualquiera de las compañías que se presentaron en el mapa de Silicon Valley. Y esta disputa por la información tiene que ver con un control que es territorial, que contiene cables, que contiene servidores, que contiene rutas por los que pasa la información. Y en el caso de México, pues bueno, prácticamente todo el control de estos cables es América Móvil, el señor Carlos Slim, y todos los cables que pasan de Latinoamérica por México hacia Estados Unidos van hacia unas terminales que aparecieron en algún momento en algún mapa, 2 en Texas y 2 en California. Son los centros por los que pasa toda la información que se produce en este país y prácticamente en todo el continente. Para el resto del continente hay otros servidores y bueno, uno de los cables en disputa es una conexión que hay a través del Pacífico que va se planea hacer una extensión que llegue al puerto de Lázaro Cárdenas. Y bueno, pues eso nos puede dar a entender por qué hay tanta disputa en esa zona para el control de ese cable, que en alguna presentación se los mostraré. Hay imágenes de estos cables entrando por la playa, no es una cosa conspiracionista. Entonces, la pregunta entonces para mí, que pues, esto es muy importante porque generalmente solemos voltear a otros países para pensar en estos sistemas de vigilancia. Y por eso me gusta mucho la analogía con Eritrea, porque además, si nosotros vemos los medios estadounidenses, se hace mucho énfasis en la falta de libertad de Internet en Rusia o en Corea del Norte. Y cuando vemos Russia Today, pues ellos hacen énfasis en la falta de libertad en Estados Unidos y en Reino Unido. Lo cierto es que el primer país del mundo en prohibir, en tener legalizado el bloqueo de teléfonos celulares y de redes sociales en caso de un disturbio social fue el Reino Unido. Cuando vieron las reacciones en Egipto y en Libia, el Reino Unido fue el primer país en tomar medidas precautorias, viendo el tamaño del riesgo que estaba. Entonces, bueno, claro, algo que me gusta mucho es hacer analogía de estos gobiernos y explicar que es una mascarada que el gobierno quiera decir que pretende observar y vigilar a todos para identificar las amenazas. Nos preguntamos, bueno, ¿las amenazas hacia quién? Y me gusta mucho cómo lo resuelves porque efectivamente la clave de este asunto es que el ciudadano ya no aparece, cada vez aparece menos en terrenos muy específicos como los electorales, pero ya no aparece para nada en el terreno de las redes sociales o en el terreno de los medios de comunicación, sino aparecemos como audiencia, como usuarios, como consumidores de productos, y entonces al ser nosotros etiquetados de ese modo, poco a poco se va presentando esta información como una manera de ubicarnos frente a la corporación y frente al gobierno. Nuestra identidad está marcada, la manera de relacionarnos con ellos está identificada de inicio como usuario y no más como ciudadano. Eso me parece muy importante que lo hagas énfasis, porque pues bueno, nosotros todavía ahorita estamos preocupados por el uso represivo que pueda hacer los gobiernos de esta información. Sin embargo, pues bueno, quien controla esa información ya de hecho son estas corporaciones. El gobierno solamente está como reaccionando a algo a lo que llegó tarde, y entonces está intentando recuperar un cierto terreno porque hasta ahora el sistema político es el que tiene el control del sistema militar, pero podríamos estar ante una transición, y ahí eso sería algo que me gustaría conocer tu opinión, porque este asunto del hackear el teléfono, de hackear Sony, es como si alguien ya tuviera esa información y ese acceso y esa capacidad para proteger no los ciudadanos, no las personas, sino el dispositivo, el aparato. Y acerca de lo que comentabas, una cosa curiosa es que en México hubo una caricatura sobre el hackeo de Apple. Te lo voy a buscar porque es interesante, porque cuando se maneja en México la cuestión de la disputa que si el FBI puede hackear o no el teléfono de Apple, y y cuando ya por fin el FBI dice haberlo podido hacer, se presenta en un periódico mexicano una caricatura de que para hacerlo tuvieron que venir a México y buscar a uno de los personajes, digamos, como de los barrios bajos de la Ciudad de México, y que hacen el hackeo de estos teléfonos todos los días, y que los conocemos, están afuera del metro. Y entonces se hizo esta broma porque efectivamente en México pues nos preguntamos, ¿pero por qué será un problema hackear un teléfono si lo pueden hackear aquí a 500 metros de distancia? Entonces, nosotros sabemos que eso pasa, que la gente le roban sus teléfonos, les hackean el teléfono y los cambian y cambian de usuario, etcétera. Y por eso es que sigue el robo de teléfonos en este país. Entonces, es un asunto porque nosotros nos vamos dando cuenta que pues no es un fenómeno propio de un país, sino que lo estamos viendo a partir de estas, pues, son como regiones tecnológicas o algo así. Es como una nueva forma de globalización. Que hasta hace muy poco los tratados de libre comercio, que son tratados militares, eran entre países adyacentes, pero cada vez más vamos viendo que se están promoviendo tratados de libre comercio entre países que no son adyacentes, y esto puede ser solamente posible dentro de este marco cibernético. Entonces, creo que es importante todo este asunto porque en el caso de México, la persecución a periodistas y el cierre de estaciones de radio independientes, el cierre de estaciones de radio indígenas, tiene al resto de la sociedad completamente pasmada ante esta situación. Pareciera no comprender el tamaño de la intromisión en la vida privada que tienen estas cuestiones. Entonces, no es un fenómeno solamente estadounidense o que pudiera explicarse a través de la cultura estadounidense tal vez, sino pues es algo más profundo que también estamos viviendo nosotros en México, y cuando he ido en otros lugares, pues parece ser un fenómeno global. Me llama particularmente la atención, y con esto quisiera yo terminar, lo que mencionabas de que el Internet como un instrumento para la diáspora de Eritrea, para poder hacer fact-checking acerca de lo que estaba pasando, de lo que el gobierno afirma, de lo que dicen, porque bueno, pues sabemos que los gobiernos son buenos para exaltarse a sí mismos, son buenos si no se elogian ellos mismos, ¿quién lo va a hacer? Pero resulta que me llamó mucho la atención esto que dices, porque resulta que el Internet en México también, la población que lo usa para estar contrastando información, pues es muy activa. Y sí, es verdad, hay muchísimos mexicanos que fuera de México están más activos y mejor enterados de lo que está pasando en este país, precisamente porque no tienen estos controles o exceso de información a lo que estamos expuestos los que estamos adentro. Entonces, ahora que estoy estudiando el caso de las elecciones estadounidenses y particularmente el preocupante caso de Donald Trump, me doy cuenta cómo, pues bueno, un periódico como Washington Post, que tiene una sección acerca de fact-checking y que tiene unas calificaciones para decir qué tanto miente un político, pues bueno, era bastante, digamos, grave que apareciera un político allí en esa sección y que le hicieran aseveraciones de que no estaba siendo preciso en sus comentarios o algo así. Lo más grave que te podía pasar era que te dieran un Pinocho, que es una mentira flagrante. Y pues bueno, sí había alguno que otro político que había mentido flagrantemente y que lo había exhibido esta columna. En el caso de Trump, en solamente un mes lleva 4 Pinochos. Es decir, miente flagrantemente todo el tiempo. Y entonces lo hace, y lo hace en total impunidad. Forma parte de su estrategia para tomar el poder. Entonces, en esta cuestión de que está desapareciendo el ciudadano, de que está ocurriendo un nuevo usuario, está surgiendo un usuario que pareciera estar asociado a estas políticas nuevas, a estas nuevas formas de hacer política que no son, pues, que se parecen más a un reality show que a un sistema electoral, es en donde estamos viendo la transformación política ante nuestros ojos. Entonces, pues bueno, yo me detengo ahí porque yo creo que sí, esta tendencia del gobierno de Estados Unidos se está amplificando hacia otros países, incluyéndonos hacia nosotros, la transformación política que está ocurriendo al interior de Estados Unidos a raíz de la aparición de este personaje en escena, nos va a, independientemente de que gane o no, nos va a plantear una vez más el poder de estos usuarios y no de estos ciudadanos, pues bueno, la relación de las corporaciones, personajes empresariales entrando al campo político. Entonces son como elementos que se están difuminando en este momento, como se están haciendo borrosos, están dejando de ser como eran, y pues bueno, ese trabajo me parece muy importante para ir previendo lo que viene, que no es optimista, por supuesto, lo que viene, pero bueno, me encuentro muy valioso que estemos viendo entre el polvo del caos en el que estamos ahorita sumidos y que nos impide ver exactamente lo que nos está pasando. Ese trabajo me parece que nos ayuda a clarificar. Te agradezco mucho que lo traigas aquí a compartir con nosotros y espero que haya oportunidad de seguirlo conversando. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. ¿Y ahora? Ahora vamos a dar la palabra a la doctora Gloria Luz Alejandre Ramírez, quien es profesora e investigadora de tiempo completo de la Universidad Autónoma de la Ciudad de México. Ella cuenta con un doctorado en Ciencias Políticas y Sociales con orientación hacia la ciencia política, así que a lo mejor está muy a gusto aquí en el CISAN con todos los politólogos, como decía Edith. También tiene maestría en Ciencia Política y licenciatura en Ciencias Políticas y Administración Pública por la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la UNAM. También es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores. Y ella cuenta con un rango muy amplio de trabajos publicados en materia de Estado, sistema político mexicano, cambio político y pragmatismo, así como en temáticas asociadas a las políticas públicas de género, la historia y la participación política de las mujeres en México y además otros sobre la globalización, la democracia y la ciudadanía. Así que es una persona perfecta para comentar esta ponencia. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Annalise. Sin antes agradecer la invitación por parte del Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte a la doctora Edina Nantal y sin duda a la doctora Lourdes Marquina, que me trajo hasta acá y que agradezco muchísimo la propuesta y sin duda también agradezco la recepción por parte de ustedes. Bien, me voy a centrar en el trabajo de la doctora Victoria Bernal, que sin duda me parece importante, fundamental, muy propicia. Y voy a dar lectura a algunos puntos que tengo para comentar con ella. Inicio. Sin duda, centrarnos en temas que aluden a las condiciones tecnológicas que actualmente dominan el orbe nos pone en diferentes posturas. Por una parte, las que hablan de mecanismos de extensión y expansión de libertades y por otras las que cuestionan la presencia y ausencia de los estados. El estudio que nos comparte la doctora Bernal toca estas vertientes. Por una parte tenemos un estado nacido hacia 1993, Eritrea, al norte de África, que en estricto sentido nos remite a la conformación de un nuevo estado que se escinde de otro en su momento autoritario y represor, pero que en su conformación de gobierno adquiere tales características. Las posturas entre apertura y libertades versus control y represión parecen matizadas por el elemento característico del Estado y el sometimiento de éste al escrutinio de una sociedad más abierta, participativa, pero sobre todo altamente inquisidora y directa sobre el actuar gubernamental. El tránsito que hace nuestra autora desde la región de Eritrea hacia Silicon Valley para colocarnos en dos posicionamientos y en dos visiones de Estado es por demás interesante y consecuente con las realidades tecnológicas y con las posturas en una y otra. El concepto que nos ofrece de infopolíticas para llamar la atención a las luchas sobre la dirección de la información y el control de las mismas es decir, sobre las políticas de información impuestas en Eritrea, de las cuales los propios habitantes y ciudadanos buscan evadir con todo el valor que implica romper con condiciones represivas de un Estado que se comporta en ese mismo tenor, represivo sin duda. ¿Qué pasa entonces con las condiciones de transparencia y manejo de los datos e información tanto que controlan los estados como el manejo masivo de la población con amplias posibilidades, incluso a su vez, de control de esta y del mismo uso? En condiciones actuales y de Estado de Derecho, el uso de los datos personales, o decirlo mínimo, se sujetan a ciertas restricciones de control gubernamental a través de organismos de naturaleza autónoma, como es el caso mexicano, a través del Instituto Nacional de Acceso a la Información. Pero, como en cualquier otro Estado que aún no logra la adecuada distancia entre control y libertades, carece de homogeneidad en sus procesos internos para garantizar, por un lado, el uso de los datos personales y también garantizar la privacidad, y por otro, la inconmensurable apertura tecnológica y de uso que la población hace de ella. Incluso organizaciones como Anonymous, que en cuestión de segundos se puede atribuir controles sobre la información y datos personales de individuos de cualquier condición y en cualquier situación, son solo asegurarse a las redes sociales, asegurarse al Internet y asegurarse de medios masivos como la televisión cada vez más rezagada. El activismo vía Internet, sin duda, cobra sentido y fuerza en espacios constreñidos y a su vez reta y fisura la figura del Estado, tanto represor como democrático, y somete a escrutinio su propia legitimidad. Si bien el paso previo a instaurar un Estado como Eritrea transcurrió o pasó por un proceso de independencia y separación de una comunidad territorial mayor puesta en Egipto, estamos entonces en unas condiciones de libertad y democracia, sin duda. La acción tanto estatal como ciudadana se concreta en ello. Sin embargo, el propio Estado naciente se ve rebasado desde su nacimiento por su inmersión natural en un mundo globalizado. Aquí es un punto importante, o sea, hacia 1993 ya estamos inmersos en procesos de globalización y de construcción, de expansión tecnológica amplia. Es decir, el Estado como Eritrea nacen en pleno crecimiento y recorrido del proceso de expansión de la globalización. Sería contra natura ponerle controles o restricciones estrictas o represivas a una comunidad que se integra bajo el signo de la libertad que implican los Estados en un mundo globalizado. Sin embargo, este punto se agudiza. La lógica del control se convierte por sí mismo en una lógica de Estado, en su autoconcepción de seguridad nacional y sin duda en la autoconnotación de vigilancia extrema puesta en el establecimiento de un Estado de Derecho que alude a esquemas de seguridad personal, individual, social y por ende estatal. La condición de la vigilancia tiene un sentido de ida y vuelta, un Estado altamente vigilante con una ciudad hiperinformada y sensible al uso de tecnologías y de información que puede, en estricto sentido, evidenciar acciones de gobierno poco honestas o de alta confidencialidad dentro de la lógica de secreto de Estado. Y a su vez, un Estado que cuenta con las herramientas legales y coercitivas que validan y promueven incluso violentar la privacidad individual. La cuestión aquí es que ya no se trata de un individuo al cual se somete a un proceso de tortura física agrediendo su persona, sin duda atentando contra derechos humanos de manera evidente y burda, sino que ahora se trata de violentar derechos humanos por el uso y manejo de equipos sofisticados que pueden almacenar cualquier cantidad de información, y ahí radica buena parte del problema, la información, que se vuelve el elemento clave, el factor a vulnerar o el que vulnera. El tema es a qué o a quién vulnera. Como bien dice nuestra ponente, podemos estar ante una guerra del terror en línea del cual somos actores protagónicos a cada segundo mientras estemos conectados a un equipo o incluso alejados de ello. La información, el uso de datos, estadísticas, imágenes, videos, fotografías, voces, audios, etcétera, que se convierten en el factor de persecución o bien en el elemento de uso de poder de quien los tenga a mano. La lógica de la transparencia en el uso de datos y su otra cara, el manejo de la privacidad y cuidado de los datos personales, se centra en una pregunta: ¿hasta dónde y con quién fines? ¿Quién la usa y en qué momento? Esta lógica de ida y vuelta, que ya mencioné, estaría centrada en esta acción gubernamental del control versus la acción de la sociedad civil en demanda de la rendición de cuentas, donde la sociedad civil se autoproclama como tal para distinguirse de la esfera del Estado, citando a Ackerman, pero que sin duda también los recubre de un matiz político que es muy común en el caso mexicano, que en ocasiones contribuye a la opacidad de la información. El tema de la opacidad, como bien plantea la doctora Bernal, se convierte en la piedra de toque medular. Quien conoce nuestra información y maneja nuestros datos, nos controla. Desde el elemental saludo vía un correo electrónico inofensivo hasta epístolas completas cargadas de detalles de toda índole, personales, familiares o laborales, sin que tengamos claro por dónde pueden transitar en el infinito mundo del ciberespacio. Como dice la doctora Bernal, en una lógica de panóptico moderno a cargo de un observador que desconocemos y el cual nos puede tener plenamente identificados, haciendo de nuestra supuesta experiencia de privacidad en la red un verdadero peligro por exposición continua. La condición de sentirnos vigilados y vigilar a la vez se convierte en un ritual, ya que esta medida podemos autogarantizarnos protección. El Estado, en particular el norteamericano, refuerza sus posturas de seguridad nacional después de los embates del 9/11 del 2001. No podía ser de otro modo. Con ello, la guerra del terror informático se intensifica en condiciones de seguridad nacional, pulverizando condiciones de Estado de Derecho en materia de uso y resguardo de datos personales. Ante una situación de esta naturaleza, prevalece la postura de seguridad nacional y de ciberseguridad sobre cualquier lógica de Estado de Derecho y de respeto a la privacidad como materia sustancial de los derechos humanos. Es la seguridad del Estado la que prevalece sobre cualquier condición de derecho o libertad. Es lo que llamaríamos razón de Estado que puede, en estricto sentido, cancelar libertades o apropiarse de ellas como lógica racional de Estado. La presencia y acción de la sociedad civil, en este punto, cobra relevancia ante el uso cada vez más sofisticado de datos, replanteando la relación entre sociedad y Estado, insisto, en una relación de ida y vuelta. El uso que el Estado hace de la información confidencial a su vez, y quiero citar a Mauricio Merino, y a su vez el derecho de acceso a la información pública, como cualquier otro derecho fundamental, debe ser el mismo para todos los ciudadanos, pero las políticas de transparencia deben ser tan diversas como las organizaciones que componen el complejo y extenso llamado sector público. El derecho supone la existencia de información a la que pueden acceder los ciudadanos, con independencia del modo en que se haya producido, mientras que la política implica el propósito deliberado de actuar y decidir sobre la base de información que no solamente puede, eventualmente, de forma potencial y aún selectiva, ser pública, sino que de hecho lo es y debe serlo en cada momento. Ahora bien, en el uso de la tecnología y la protección de datos personales también tiene un doble cariz el funcionario que protege los datos y del que es exhibido con su propia información privada por su condición de funcionario en cualquier latitud. Y aquí cito a Juan Pablo Guerrero Amparam, que en su momento fue comisionado del Instituto Federal de Acceso a la Información. Una cosa es transparentar la vida pública y otra, destruir la vida personal de los servidores públicos a través de la publicación de aspectos de su intimidad o peor aún, difamarlos. Al tratar el problema de la difamación de servidores públicos en los Estados Unidos de América, en donde entran en conflicto la libertad de expresión y el derecho a la privacidad, aquí citando a Owen Fees, aborda la cuestión central de la protección de la vida privada de los servidores públicos y sugiere que en realidad el cargo público obliga a la renuncia a tramos de privacidad, cuestión que crece a medida que se eleva a nivel de discrecionalidad del puesto. La decisión de dotar de poder discrecional a un individuo debe, en buena medida, basarse en el conocimiento de carácter de este individuo, pues es la mejor indicación sobre la forma como usará el poder. Con esto, ampliando y un poco cerrando para abrir la discusión, finalmente está implícito aquí el tema del poder. Se posiciona en materia de información y manejo de datos, sea del lado del Estado o sea del lado de la sociedad, que es una cuestión continua a analizar. Es decir, aquí estamos en una situación de poderes divididos entre el Estado y la sociedad. Mientras el Estado nos controla, nosotros como individuos, como sociedad civil organizada, controlamos al Estado, o tratamos de controlar al Estado, o creemos controlar al Estado. Sin embargo, aquí la condición de poder es la predominante y es una condición de naturaleza estatal. Creo que ahí es donde está centrado el punto. Muchas gracias. Felicidades, doctora.
Y ahora, bueno, teníamos al principio la idea de que esta también fuera una conversación, como dice la compañera, de ida y vuelta. Entonces, vamos a darle una oportunidad a la doctora Bernal para contestar a todos esos comentarios, pero primero nos gustaría ver si alguien más tiene algunas preguntas, comentarios que quisieran plantear. A ver.
Thank you for your presentation. I really liked it. I have a work project here at CISAN, which is called Contact Zones for Skilled Diasporas in North America. So maybe we have to talk a little bit afterwards. But, well, I wanted to ask a couple of questions on the Eritrean case. How do digital diasporas affect domestic politics? I would like to know. I mean, in this case, does it lead to more connectivity inside the country? Is it a more open society, or it has no effect at all on what happens inside Eritrea? And another question is, based on your research with diaspora, are digital diasporas stronger when they come from countries of origin less democratic, such as North Korea? I don't know about it. Or, I don't know, other African cases. It is difficult to speak about non-democratic countries anymore, but still there are some cases today. So these are my questions. Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Comentario? Pues vamos con eso entonces. Ya le damos la palabra a Victoria para que nos diga.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. I'll start with the second one first about what might make some digital diasporas stronger. And one of the specific things about the Eritrean diaspora that is that because during the 30 years war with Ethiopia for independence, it was basically a transnational movement. The leadership inside the country organized among refugees and exiles and created cells. And there was a constant flow of information and resources from outside because the Eritrean guerrillas really were not supported by external powers. So they depended a great deal on resources actually sent from Eritreans who are around the world. So this was kind of a unique thing, that Eritreans in diaspora already were organized, an organized transnational network. But the exciting thing was that some of the ones based in the U.S. who were working in technological fields were early adopters of the internet, of computer stuff for Eritrean politics, because they already had this incredible political transnational network. And so there was a great synergy for them with the internet. So I think they were among the early adopters of this technology, and I think they've done a lot of, some reviewers have criticized my work as being too celebratory, because I really do, I actually, think it's a very optimistic story in many ways, and I admire the creativity, what Eritreans were able to do. But the initial organization of them as a transnational political force was done by the leadership inside Eritrea. So I think that's very different than the experience of many other diasporas that have to struggle much more from the ground up to create these communities and to create the networks and lines that connect people. The other part about how does it change inside? I mean, this is hard to measure in many ways, but some of the posters who are prolific contributors of texts in Eritrean cyberspace, they believe that, you know, they have made criticisms that the government responds to. And we do hear from some researchers and observers who have gotten access that members of the government are, the first thing they do every day is apparently check on the dissident websites to see what's being said about them. So they're, you know, but of course the government remains incredibly repressive and autocratic. The other thing is how these efforts reach the citizens, like leapfrogging over the control of the government. And they've come up with creative ways of doing that, including broadcasting through satellite radio directly into Eritrea. One of the founders of the Asmarino website explained to me one time that one method he used was sending political faxes. And he said, yes, okay, maybe the minister whose office that fax would go to is not going to respond to it, but who receives the fax? The secretary receives the fax, and she's going to know that the people are not forgotten, that we're fighting for them outside, and she will spread the word. So kind of a kind of, you know, subversive way of using a more official channel of pretending to communicate to the minister when really you want to get the word to the lower level clerical people who work in the office, who would be the ones actually seeing the facts. So they hope to mobilize opinion inside Eritrea, but it's very difficult to assess that because the punishment for engaging in any kind of protest or any kind of political activity within Eritrea is so drastic. I mean, basically the government just disappears people. There's no rule of law whatsoever. In fact, if you when I was writing something, I looked on the U.S. government website, it's like ustravel.gov, which gives you information if you're going to travel to that country. They included a special warning on the U.S. government site to diaspora Eritreans, saying basically, we cannot protect you, even though you're an American citizen. If you go to Eritrea, the government does not recognize that you have renounced Eritrean citizenship, and they may take you and they may imprison you and they will not notify us, and there's nothing we can do to help you, so you should know this before you go. So it's an extreme.
Creo que hay otra pregunta. A ver. So the translators can hear you.
I own a dumb phone.
Oh.
Everybody wants me to buy a smartphone, but now you convinced me I should keep mine. I have a neoliberalism question. Every time you go to an anthropology conference, the word neoliberalism comes up right away. You edited a book with the word neoliberalism in the title.
It's obligatory.
You spoke for 55 minutes and you did not use the word neoliberalism at all. Not once. And you kept using the word government, where most other discussions of this kind, we talk about the state apparatus. And perhaps this is just something that Americans do. We talk about the government, everyone else talks about the state. But in the world where I live, government and state apparatus they're not the same thing. And the question of the neoliberalism is all the discussions we have is about the retreat of the state and the gradual expansion of private neoliberal thinking and acting within the state, as all of us know. And I'm sure Snowden actually didn't work for the government. I think he worked for a company under the government, and these contractors. But the way you describe it is just the opposite of neoliberalism. The state is getting bigger and bigger and nastier. And of course, if North Korea got the technology that you talked about today, or Romania, where I used to live a long time ago, things would be really nasty. So my question is, have you changed your mind? Has all this made you change your mind about encroaching neoliberalism and the retreat of the state? Because the way you talk about it, neoliberalism becomes almost irrelevant, at least in the discussion that you're talking about here.
Okay, great. I think there's a couple of things. One thing is that Eritrea is not a neoliberal state. So neoliberalism is not a useful lens to understand how a state like Eritrea, where the government controls the economy, the government really does not want any private interests, whether corporate or civil society, to have any other source of power in the country besides the ruling party. So I think in many ways, this idea that neoliberalism has just blanketed the whole world and that everything can be viewed through that lens misses something, because there are cases like Eritrea that you can't really fit it into the neoliberal theory. The other thing, if we look at the U.S., I think, the state has retreated from public education. It's retreated from, certain domains, but it certainly has not retreated from militaristic investment and security-focused kinds of things. So I think, and the other neoliberal side of it might be thinking about the significant role of corporations like the Silicon Valley digital corporations. And I think looking, the way in which people are being hailed as users and consumers, of course, is a big part of consumer capitalism, which is central to a neoliberal cultural kind of thing. And thinking about that whole issue of the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, being Americans' biggest defense against their own government so I think there are neoliberal elements, but I have to say, I think, as you said, neoliberalism became such a buzzword, such a blanket term that it starts to lose an explanatory value unless we define it and use it in one particular aspect that we're looking at.
Bueno, ya me dieron la señal de que el tiempo nos viene encima, entonces pues quiero agradecerles tanto a nuestra ponente como a nuestros comentaristas. Muchísimas gracias por esas participaciones tan valiosas. Vamos a tomar un pequeño descanso de 10 minutos y vamos a regresar aquí a las 12:30 para la próxima mesa. Pues muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes y nos vemos en 10 minutos.
Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you too. Thank you so much for your attention.